The air inside the Bethesda Row Mall in Maryland was thick with the scent of expensive vanilla and the muffled hum of Saturday afternoon commerce when the sound of the world breaking apart finally arrived. It wasn't a loud noise at first, but the sickening thud of a designer leather boot connecting with soft ribs made every shopper within 30 yards go still as the vibration of the impact seemed to travel through the very floorboards. Sloane watched in a state of paralyzed, crystalline shock as Fenris, the jet-black Doberman she had nursed back from the brink of starvation, was sent skidding across the white marble floor like a piece of discarded luggage. He slammed into a towering display of hand-blown Venetian glass vases, and the subsequent explosion of 1,000 shards sounded like a symphony of screams made of crystal that echoed up to the 3-story glass ceiling. Before the truth behind this cold-blooded act is revealed and the predator becomes the prey, tell us where you are watching from and turn on notifications to follow Sloane's journey of ultimate redemption. Sloane was on her knees before the echoes of the shattering glass even died away, her hands hovering over the dog's trembling frame as he let out a pained, shallow whimper that tore through her soul. She didn't need to look up to recognize the man standing over her. She knew the polished, mirror-like gleam of those $300 shoes and the heavy, metallic scent of his cologne better than she knew her own reflection. Silas stood there, smoothing the front of his designer coat with a slow, rhythmic arrogance, his handsome face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated contempt that made the bright holiday lights overhead feel cold and dim. He was the man who had systematically dismantled her life over the last 2 years, the man who had stolen her father's legacy, her home, and her dignity, leaving her to survive in the shadows of the city while he ascended the social ladder on the rungs of her suffering. I warned you about showing your face in public, Sloane, but I never expected you to stoop this low, dragging a mangy stray into a place where people actually have class, Silas sneered, his voice cutting through the hushed atrium like a dull blade. He remained completely oblivious to the fact that the dog he had just assaulted was currently wearing a high-frequency tactical transmitter hidden in his heavy leather collar, a device that had already sent a silent, high-priority distress signal to a secure private server located halfway across the world in Seoul. Silas didn't see the way the mall's high-tech security cameras suddenly swiveled with predatory intent, locking onto his face as if he were a target in a sniper's crosshairs. And he didn't notice the 3 men in charcoal suits who had just stepped out of a black SUV at the north entrance. He was too busy reveling in the sight of Sloane's desperation, unaware that the countdown to his utter ruin had just hit 0 the moment his boot touched that dog. Sloane's fingers brushed against Fenris's jaw, and her breath hitched when she felt it, a small, cold piece of hardware lodged firmly between the dog's teeth. It was the encrypted drive Silas had spent months trying to find, the one containing the digital proof of the embezzlement he had pinned on her, and in his blind rage, he had just kicked the very creature that was holding his fate. Silas reached down, his fingers clamping onto Sloane's arm with a bruising force to pull her up and humiliate her further, but he never got the chance to exert his power. The temperature in the mall seemed to plummet as the main entrance doors hissed open with a violence that made the nearby glass cases rattle in their frames. A man emerged from the afternoon glare, a tall, striking figure wrapped in a long black coat that billowed behind him like the wings of a dark omen. Kaelen, the man whispered about in the highest circles of international power as the Iron King, didn't run, but his pace was a masterpiece of lethal efficiency. That commanded the space around him. His eyes weren't on the crowd or the luxury stores, they were fixed on the injured Doberman and the woman currently shielding him, and the air around him crackled with a fury so dense it was almost visible to the naked eye. Silas felt the shift in the atmosphere, his arrogance beginning to leak away as his face turned the color of bone, but he still didn't know the truth. He didn't know that the man walking toward him was the same man his family had been trying to appease for decades, and he certainly didn't know that the woman he called a nobody was now the most protected person in the state. Silas tried to find his voice, a weak, stuttering sound that barely reached across the marble. "This woman is a thief," She stole that dog from my estate. Kaelen didn't let him finish, nor did he even acknowledge Silas's existence. He reached out with a gloved hand and caught Silas's wrist in a grip that made the man's knees buckle instantly. You kicked my protector, Kaelen said, his voice a low, melodic baritone that carried the weight of a death sentence. And you laid hands on my woman. The entire mall seemed to freeze in time as the realization rippled through the gathered crowd. This wasn't just a confrontation, it was a total transition of power. Kaelen's gaze moved to Sloane, and for a fleeting second, the ice in his expression melted into a look of such profound, possessive heat that it made her heart hammer against her ribs. Silas tried to pull away, but he was nothing more than a moth caught in a spider's web. He was about to find out that when you kick a king's pack, you don't just lose your dignity, you lose everything you ever thought was yours. Sloane stood up, the encrypted drive safely tucked into her palm, realizing that the man she had feared was now at the mercy of the man who had been searching for her. The first chapter of Silas's downfall had begun, and the plot twist he never expected was that his own violence had delivered the evidence right into the hands of his executioner. As the guards approached and Kaelen's shadows moved in, Sloane knew that the world was finally going to see the truth, and the monster standing before her was about to become a ghost in his own city. The game had changed, and the king was finally home. The silence that followed Kaelen's declaration was so absolute it felt like the oxygen had been sucked out of the entire Bethesda Row atrium, leaving Silas gasping for air as the weight of the Iron King's grip turned his world into a blur of white-hot pain. Every person with a smartphone was now a silent witness to the exact moment the golden boy of Maryland's elite began his descent into oblivion, and Silas's eyes darted around the circle of spectators, looking for a shred of sympathy that simply wasn't there. Sloane watched him, her fingers still trembling as they combed through Fenris's thick fur, feeling the dog's heart rate begin to settle even as her own reached a frantic, syncopated rhythm. Before we dive into the dark secrets hidden within that encrypted drive, don't forget to subscribe to Melanin and the Mafia's pack and drop a comment below if you've ever wanted to see a bully get exactly what they deserved. Kaelen didn't need to raise his voice to command the space. His presence alone was a suffocating force that made the mall's security team look like children playing soldier, and with a single, sharp nod to the men in charcoal suits, the perimeter was sealed. Silas tried to muster a final spark of his former arrogance, his face twisting into a sneer that didn't quite hide the terror leaking into his eyes. You're making a mistake, whoever you are. I have friends in the governor's office and a legal team that will have you in a federal cell by midnight, Silas hissed, his voice cracking like dry parchment. Kaelen's response was a slow, ghost of a smile that never reached his eyes, which remained as cold and unyielding as the obsidian depths of the Pacific. Your friends have already stopped answering their phones, Silas, and your legal team is currently busy trying to figure out why their firm's accounts were just flagged for international money laundering, Kaelen whispered, the words hitting Silas with the force of a physical blow. The three men in suits moved with a synchronized, predatory grace, stepping forward to box Silas in as Kaelen finally released his wrist, leaving behind dark, bruised fingerprints that looked like a permanent brand of failure. Sloane felt a surge of something she hadn't felt in years, hope, but it was tempered by the mystery of the man standing before her, a man whose reputation for ruthlessness was only eclipsed by the sudden, jarring tenderness in his gaze when he looked back at her. Fenris let out a soft, guttural growl as Silas tried to take a step back, and the dog finally opened his mouth, letting the small, silver-encrypted drive fall into Sloane's palm with a soft clink. Kaelen's eyes locked onto the device, and for a split second, a flicker of something resembling recognition passed over his features, but his priority remained the woman kneeling in the wreckage of a shattered display. He chose you, Kaelen said, his voice dropping to a private, intimate frequency that seemed to exclude the rest of the world. Fenris hasn't let anyone touch him for years, let alone protect them with his life. Sloane looked from the powerful man to the fierce dog, realizing that the stray she had saved was the only bridge between her ruined past and a future she couldn't yet imagine. Silas, realizing the tide had turned into a tsunami, tried to make a break for the exit, but he was intercepted by a security guard who had once laughed at his jokes but now looked at him with nothing but cold professional distance. "Mr. Vance, we've been instructed to hold you until the authorities arrive to discuss the animal cruelty charges and the little matter of the fraudulent wire transfers discovered in your boutique's books this morning," the guard stated, his voice flat. Silas's knees finally gave out, and he slumped against the marble, a broken shell of a man who was beginning to understand that his money was a paper shield against a steel blade. Kaelen reached down, offering his hand to Sloane, and as her fingers disappeared into his leather-clad grip, she felt a current of electricity that made the mall's bright lights seem to flare with intensity. "Come, Sloane, the air in this place is tainted by the scent of a coward, and we have much to discuss regarding that drive and the debt I owe you for keeping my pack whole," Kaelen said, pulling her to her feet with an effortless strength. He didn't wait for her to agree, he simply began to lead her toward the private exit, with Fenris limping slightly but head held high at her side, leaving Silas to the cameras and the consequences. As they stepped out into the crisp Maryland afternoon, where a fleet of black SUVs sat idling like a pride of lions, Sloane realized that Silas was the least of her worries now. The nightmare of her past was over, but the mystery of the Iron King was just beginning, and the drive in her hand felt like it was humming with the power to either save her or destroy everything she had left. But the real shock came when Kaelen opened the door for her and leaned in, his voice a low promise against her ear. "Silas thinks he lost everything today, but he hasn't even seen the bill yet." What she didn't know yet was that the drive didn't just contain evidence against Silas, it contained a secret about Sloane's own father that would change the very blood in her veins. The storm hadn't passed, it was just changing direction, and Silas was about to find out that being broke was the kindest thing Kaelen had planned for him. As the SUVs pulled away from the curb, leaving the mall behind, Sloane caught a glimpse of Silas being led away in handcuffs, his designer coat torn and his pride in taches. It was the first time she had felt safe in years, but as she looked at Kaelen's profile, silhouetted against the afternoon sun, she realized she had just traded a wolf for a lion. The rising storm was here, and for the first time, Sloane wasn't running from the lightning, she was the one holding it. The interior of the SUV felt like a high-tech fortress on wheels, the air-conditioned silence so heavy it seemed to hum with the residual power of the man sitting just inches away from Sloane. As the skyline of Maryland blurred into a smear of orange and gray against the darkening horizon, Sloane felt the weight of the silver drive pressing into her palm, a tiny piece of metal that had suddenly become the center of her universe. Kaelen sat with his back straight and his eyes fixed on the road ahead, his silhouette sharp and uncompromising against the passing streetlights like a statue carved from midnight. Fenris was sprawled across the floorboards between them, his breathing deep and rhythmic as he finally surrendered to the exhaustion of his injuries, his large head resting trustingly against Sloane's ankle. The silence wasn't empty, it was a living thing, charged with 1,000 questions Sloane was too afraid to ask and 1,000 secrets Kaelen wasn't yet ready to share. She looked down at the drive, the surface scratched and dull from its time in Fenris's jaws, and she realized that this wasn't just evidence against Silas, it was a key to a door she hadn't even known existed. "You're wondering why I was looking for him," Kaelen said, his voice cutting through the quiet like a low-frequency vibration that made her skin tingle. "And why Silas was so desperate to kill him for a piece of plastic." Sloane shifted in her seat, the leather creaking under her weight as she met his gaze, which was now turned toward her with a burning intensity that made her breath hitch. "I thought Silas wanted the drive because of the embezzlement he pinned on me," Sloane whispered, her voice sounding small and fragile in the vastness of the vehicle. Kaelen let out a short, dark laugh that contained no humor, only a grim sort of irony. "Silas is a small man with small ambitions, Sloane, he wanted that drive to save his skin, but he has no idea what's actually on it. What he said next changed the very gravity of the room. That drive doesn't just contain financial records, it contains the blueprints for a security network your father built for the Seoul Syndicate 20 years ago. The air in the car suddenly felt too thin to breathe as Sloane processed the words, her mind racing back to the memories of her father, a man she thought was a simple software engineer in Baltimore. The plot twist hit her like a physical blow. Her father hadn't just been a victim of Silas, he had been a legendary architect for the underworld, and Silas had used her to get close to his greatest work. But that was only the beginning. The SUV pulled into the gated entrance of a massive, secluded estate hidden deep in the Maryland woods, a place where the trees seemed to lean in to hide the glass and steel structure from the rest of the world. As the gates hissed shut behind them, Sloane realized she wasn't just being taken to a safe house, she was being brought into the heart of the pack's territory. The doors opened, and the scent of damp earth and pine needles rushed in, but it was overshadowed by a low, echoing howl that vibrated from the shadows of the estate. Two massive gray wolves emerged from the darkness of the porch, their eyes glowing like amber lanterns as they moved with a ghostly, synchronized grace toward the car. Sloane froze, her hand flying to Fenris's collar, but Kaelen simply stepped out and whistled a single, sharp note. The wolves didn't attack, they stopped in their tracks and bowed their heads, a display of submission that made Sloane's blood run cold with awe. "Don't be afraid, Sloane, they are part of the family, and they have been waiting for their brother to come home," Kaelen said, reaching back to help her out of the SUV. As her feet hit the gravel, she felt the eyes of the entire estate on her, an invisible network of guards and protectors who all answered to the man holding her hand. They walked toward the house, Fenris limping proudly between them, and Sloane realized that her life as a fugitive was over, but her life as a player in a global game of shadows had just begun. Kaelen led her through a grand foyer filled with ancient Korean artifacts and modern surveillance monitors, a jarring blend of history and high-tech power that defined his existence. He stopped in front of a massive oak door and turned to her, his expression unreadable but his eyes swirling with a protective fire. "Inside this room is the terminal that will unlock that drive, Sloane, but once we open it, there is no going back to the life you knew." He reached out, his thumb brushing against her cheek in a gesture so tender it felt like a betrayal of his ruthless reputation. "Are you ready to see what your father was really building?" Sloane looked at the silver drive, then at the man who had become her unexpected savior, and she felt a surge of defiance that made her spine straighten. "Silas tried to erase me, Kaelen, I want to see everything he tried to steal." The door opened, and the glow of a dozen monitors filled the room, casting a blue light over Kaelen's face that made him look like a digital god. But as Sloane stepped inside, she saw something on the main screen that made her heart stop, a live feed of Silas in his jail cell, but he wasn't alone. A man in a dark suit was standing over him, holding a phone with a message that made Silas's face turn a translucent shade of white. He didn't know that Kaelen was watching every second of his terror. He didn't know that the real punishment hadn't even started yet. Kaelen sat down at the terminal, his fingers flying across the keys with a lethal precision that made the security protocols on the drive crumble in seconds. "Silas thinks he's safe behind bars, but he's about to find out that the pack has no walls," Kaelen whispered as the first file decrypted. A map of the East Coast appeared, covered in red dots that blinked like a dying pulse, and Sloane realized with a shudder that her father's network was still active. The final secret was about to be revealed, and Silas was about to find out that the stray dog at the mall was the least of his problems. The king was finally unlocking the cage, and Sloane was the only one who held the key to the carnage. The blue luminescence of the massive monitors washed over Sloane's face, turning the room into a digital sanctuary where the air felt charged with the electricity of 1,000 secrets. Kaelen's fingers danced across the keys with a rhythm that was both beautiful and terrifying, a master pianist playing a symphony of data that was slowly unraveling everything Sloane thought she knew about her own bloodline. The red dots on the map of the East Coast weren't just random points of interest, they were pulsing like a collective heartbeat, a living network of nodes that her father had built into the very infrastructure of Maryland and New York, hidden in plain sight within the city's power grids and communication hubs. Sloane stood behind Kaelen, her hand resting on the back of his chair, the warmth of his presence the only thing keeping her grounded as the ghost of her father began to speak through the lines of code appearing on the screen. He didn't just build a security network, Sloane, he built a fail-safe, Kaelen whispered, his voice sounding raw and jagged in the quiet of the high-tech den. He knew that men like Silas and the organizations behind him would eventually come for his work, so he locked the master key inside the DNA of the one thing they would never suspect, the loyalty of a guardian. Kaelen paused, looking down at Fenris, who was now sleeping soundly on a rug by the terminal, his paw twitching as if he were running through the mall again. The plot twist was a jagged pill to swallow. Fenris hadn't been a stray at all, he was a biological bio-key, a protector specifically trained to recognize Sloane's scent and deliver the drive only to her, and Kaelen had spent years tracking the dog not just for companionship, but to find the daughter of the man he had once called his greatest mentor. But that was only the beginning of the horror, because as the final layer of encryption fell away, a video file appeared, dated just 3 days before her father's accidental fall from a Baltimore rooftop. Sloane's breath hitched as a grainy image of her father filled the center monitor, his face tired but his eyes burning with the same defiance she felt in her own soul. "Sloane, if you're seeing this, it means the pack has found you, and the drive is safe," her father's voice crackled through the speakers, making her knees weak. "Silas thinks he's playing a game of corporate takeovers, but he's a lamb being led to the slaughter by the Vane Syndicate, the men who really want this network." Kaelen's jaw tightened so hard the bones seemed to shift beneath his skin, his eyes narrowing as the name Vane appeared in the metadata. The tension in the room skyrocketed as Sloane realized Silas wasn't the mastermind, he was just a disposable tool used to infiltrate her life and get to the drive, and now that he had failed and was sitting in a jail cell in Bethesda, he was a loose thread that the syndicate would undoubtedly move to snip. Kaelen stood up, his height dwarfing the room as he turned to face her, his hands coming up to grip her shoulders with a strength that was both possessive and protective. "Silas is a dead man walking, Sloane, not because of what I'll do to him, but because of what his masters will do to cover their tracks," Kaelen stated, his voice a low promise of the carnage to come. He reached over and tapped a command on the console, and the screen split to show the live feed of Silas again. The man in the dark suit was still there, leaning close to the bars of the cell, and Silas was shaking so hard his teeth were practically rattling against each other. "But he didn't know the truth yet, he didn't know that I own the very prison he's sitting in, and no one gets to Silas unless I allow it." Kaelen's thumb traced the line of her jaw, his touch sending a jolt of static through her that made her heart race with a dangerous, intoxicating hope. The mystery of why Kaelen was so invested in her father's legacy began to clear. It wasn't just about the power of the network, it was about a debt of honor that spanned across oceans and decades. "Your father saved my life and soul when I was nothing but a soldier in the streets, Sloane. Today, the pack pays that debt in full." What she said next changed the temperature of the room again. "Then don't just protect me, Kaelen, use the network to finish what my father started and burn the Vane Syndicate to the ground." Kaelen's eyes flared with a dark, appreciative fire, a smirk playing on his lips that was more lethal than any weapon. "That was always the plan, my queen, but first, we need to show Silas exactly how much he lost when he chose to kick that dog." He turned back to the monitors, and with a single keystroke, a silent command was sent through her father's network. All across Maryland, the red dots on the map began to turn green, one by one, as the failsafe activated. The lights in Silas's jail cell began to flicker, a rhythmic, pulsing strobe that signaled the beginning of his psychological collapse. He looked around the tiny room, his arrogance now a distant memory, replaced by the primal fear of a man who knows the shadows are closing in. What Silas didn't know yet was that the stray dog he had mocked was currently the most powerful entity in the city, and the woman he had tried to break was now the hand that held the leash. The rising progression of the data on the screen showed that the syndicate was already trying to hack back in, but they were hitting a wall of code that was as unyielding as Kaelen's resolve. The emotion in Sloane's chest was a mix of grief for her father and a cold, sharp satisfaction as she realized the man who had destroyed her life was now a rat in a maze of his own making. But as the final node in DC turned green, a new alert flashed on the screen, a black site location that wasn't on her father's original map. Kaelen's expression turned into a mask of pure, focused aggression as he realized the syndicate had a secondary base right in their backyard. "They're closer than I thought, Sloane, and they're moving." The micro cliffhanger of the night arrived when the estate's silent alarm began to pulse a soft, red light against the walls of the den. Someone was at the gate, and they weren't there for a social visit. Fenris was on his feet in a second, his hackles raised and a low, vibrating growl echoing in his chest that told Sloane everything she needed to know. The pack was under attack, and the war for her father's legacy was no longer a game of digital codes, it was about to become a battle of blood and bone. Kaelen reached into the desk drawer and pulled out a heavy black pistol, checking the chamber with a click that sounded like a final sentence. "Stay behind me, Sloane, and don't let go of Fenris." The king was finally stepping into the arena, and Sloane was the only one he was willing to die for. The red strobe of the emergency lights painted the walls of the den in a rhythm that felt like a heartbeat on the verge of stopping, the silent alarm vibrating through the heavy oak floorboards as the sanctity of the estate was breached for the first time in a decade. Sloane felt the cold weight of the silver drive still clutched in her hand, the metal seemingly burning into her palm as she realized the shadow war her father had spent a lifetime fighting was finally knocking on her door with a murderous intent. Kaelen moved with a fluid, terrifying grace that made him seem like a part of the shadows themselves, his fingers sweeping across the terminal one last time to lock down the data before he turned to face the door with a weapon that looked like an extension of his own lethal will. Fenris stood at Sloane's side, his hackles raised like a row of jagged glass and a low, guttural vibration echoing from his chest that felt like a warning from a primitive god, his injuries seemingly forgotten in the face of a direct threat to the woman who had saved him. Kaelen reached out and grabbed Sloane's waist, pulling her flush against his chest for a split second, the heat of his body and the scent of cold steel and expensive wood smoke surrounding her like a shield. "They think they can take what belongs to me in my own home, Sloane. They're about to find out why they call me the king of the pack," he whispered, his eyes flashing with a predatory light that made her breath hitch in a mixture of fear and a dangerous, intoxicating thrill. He didn't wait for her to answer, leading her through a hidden panel in the bookshelf that opened into a narrow, stone-walled corridor lit by flickering orange emergency lamps that smelled of ancient dust and ozone. The muffled sound of gunfire began to echo from the front gates, a rhythmic, mechanical staccato that was punctuated by the deep, terrifying howls of the gray wolves who were currently tearing through the night to protect their territory. Sloane's heart hammered against her ribs as they moved deeper into the estate's tactical heart, her mind racing with the images of her father and the network he had built, realizing that the failsafe wasn't just a piece of code, it was a weapon that could be turned against the very men who were currently trying to kill them. They reached a secondary command center buried deep beneath the Maryland soil, a room filled with glowing blue glass and haptic touchscreens that hummed with a power that felt alive, and Kaelen immediately began to bring the defensive systems online with a series of sharp, decisive gestures. "Fenris, guard the door," Kaelen commanded, and the Doberman didn't hesitate, taking up a position at the threshold with his eyes fixed on the darkness of the hallway like a demon in the night. Kaelen turned back to the monitors, and the screen split to show the front gate, where a dozen men in tactical gear were being systematically dismantled by the wolves and the estate's automated defense turrets in a display of power that was as beautiful as it was horrific. But the real shock came when a second screen flickered to life, showing a high-resolution feed of the 19th precinct where Silas was currently screaming at the bars of his cell, his eyes wide with a terror that looked like it was slowly eroding his sanity. The man in the dark suit was gone, but in his place stood a single, red-eyed drone that was hovering outside the small, barred window, a laser dot focused directly on the center of Silas's forehead. The Vane Syndicate doesn't leave loose ends, Sloane. Silas is a liability they can't afford, and they're using my own father's network protocols to try and execute him in his cell, Kaelen stated, his voice a low, jagged rasp of fury. Sloane looked from the destruction at the gate to the target on her ex-fiancée's head, and for a moment, she felt a flicker of the girl she used to be, the one who would have screamed for mercy, but then she looked at Kaelen and felt the Iron King's resolve settling into her. Own marrow. Then use the fail-safe, Kaelen. If Silas is going to pay for what he did to my father, he's going to pay through me, not them, she said, her voice steadying as she stepped up to the haptic glass and placed her hand next to his. The digital interface rippled under her touch, recognizing her DNA through the sensor Kaelen had keyed into her father's drive, and suddenly the map of the East Coast flared into a brilliant, blinding white. The plot twist was a masterpiece of hidden design. Her father hadn't just built a network, he had built a virus that would jump from his nodes into any system that tried to hack them, and the drone outside Silas's cell suddenly jerked and spun, its red eye turning a deep, royal purple as Sloane took control of it. Kaelen let out a short, sharp laugh of pure, dark appreciation, his hand coming up to rest on her shoulder as they watched the drone fly away from the precinct, leaving Silas sobbing on the floor of his cell, alive but utterly broken by the near-death experience. But the victory was short-lived, as the main gate camera showed a black-clad figure stepping through the smoke of the explosion, a man who didn't look human in the flickering light of the flames, his eyes glowing with a synthetic, cybernetic light. The Vane Executioner, Kaelen whispered, the name sounding like a death rattle in the quiet of the bunker. The staircase-like progression of the night's violence had reached its peak, and Sloane realized that the real fight hadn't even begun. The man at the gate was the Syndicate's ultimate weapon, a biological and mechanical hybrid designed specifically to counter her father's network. Kaelen checked his weapon, the click of the slide sounding like a final prayer, and he looked at Sloane with a gaze that told her he was prepared to burn the world down to keep her safe. He's here for the drive, Sloane, and he's coming for the only person who can unlock the final node. The micro cliffhanger arrived when the door behind them hissed open, and the scent of ozone and charred metal filled the room, making Fenris's growl turn into a sharp, pained bark. The executioner wasn't at the gate anymore, he was in the room, his form shimmering as he deactivated a high-tech cloaking device, and the red dot was no longer on Silas, it was on Sloane's heart. Kaelen's arm was around her in an instant, pulling her behind his massive frame, but the executioner didn't move to fire. Instead, he held up a hand and a holographic image of her father appeared in the air between them, but he wasn't speaking to her, he was speaking to the Syndicate. The mystery deepened as the audio played, a confession from her father that suggested he hadn't just built a security network, but a weapon that could wipe out the entire financial grid of the Western world, and Sloane was the only one who could provide the final biometric authorization. The emotion in the room shifted from protective to world-endingly dangerous as Kaelen realized the stakes weren't just about revenge, but about the balance of global power. The king was no longer just a mafia boss, he was the guardian of a girl who could end the world with a single word. Silas was a forgotten ghost as the real war began, and the red tide was no longer just a metaphor, it was the blood that was about to be spilled on the stone floor. Kaelen stepped toward the executioner, his eyes a void of cold fire, and the final battle for her father's soul was finally underway. The air in the subterranean bunker, ionizing with the hum of the executioner's cloaking field, felt like a premonition of the end, a static-charged silence that tasted of copper and old regrets as Sloane stood frozen behind Kaelen's mountain-like frame. The holographic image of her father flickered between them, his ghostly face a reminder that the dead still had voices in this room of cold glass and hot lead, and the executioner's synthetic eyes glowed with a predatory red light that signaled he wasn't there for words. Before we witness the final, soul-shattering destruction of the Vane Syndicate and the ultimate fate of the man who thought he could kick a king's dog and walk away, make sure you are following Melanin and the Mafia's pack and hit that subscribe and like button to show the world that the pack never forgets a debt. Kaelen didn't wait for the hybrid to make the first move. He was a blur of black cloth and lethal precision, his body slamming into the executioner with a force that sent a shockwave through the haptic floorboards and made the monitors flicker with digital pain. Fenris was a shadow in the corner, his growl now a piercing, high-frequency scream of defiance as he lunged for the executioner's throat, his teeth meeting the cold, reinforced polymer of the hybrid's neck in a clash of biological fury and mechanical engineering. Sloane watched, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird, as the two most dangerous entities in her world turned the high-tech sanctuary into a grinding mill of violence, the scent of ozone and charred metal filling the small space until it was nearly impossible to breathe. The plot twist wasn't in the strength of the machines, but in the memory of the dog. As the executioner raised a metallic arm to crush Kaelen's skull, Fenris didn't just bite. He locked his jaws onto the small, glowing node at the base of the hybrid's spine, the very same spot where her father had hidden the secondary biometric interface. The executioner froze, a high-pitched mechanical whine erupting from his chest as the virus on the silver drive, still clutched in Sloane's hand, found its final bridge through the living loyalty of the Doberman. Kaelen didn't hesitate, his pistol barked twice, the bullets finding the precise gaps in the hybrid's armor that the virus had forced open, and the executioner collapsed into a heap of sparking wires and useless metal like a fallen idol of a forgotten era. But the war wasn't over, and Kaelen turned to Sloane with a look of such raw, agonizing relief that it made the very floor feel like it was shifting beneath her feet as he pulled her into his arms, his chest heaving with the effort of the kill. The final node, Sloane, it's not a weapon of destruction, it's a mirror, Kaelen whispered, his voice a jagged rasp of exhaustion as he led her back to the main terminal where the map of the East Coast was now glowing with an ethereal, royal purple light. Sloane placed her hand on the glass, her father's failsafe finally recognizing the last sequence of her DNA, and the screen didn't show an explosion, it showed every screen in the Vane Syndicate's headquarters, every phone in the governor's pocket, and every monitor in Silas's jail cell displaying the truth of their crimes in a scrolling, unstoppable waterfall of evidence. The total annihilation was digital, a wipeout of their financial empires and their social standing that happened in the blink of an eye, turning the men who owned the city into paupers before they could even draw their next breath. Silas, sitting on the cold floor of his cell in Bethesda, watched his own face appear on the news with the word fraud emblazoned across his forehead, and for the first time, the realization that he was truly, utterly alone broke whatever was left of his hollow spirit. He had thought Sloane was a nobody, a stray to be discarded, but he was now the one in the cage, a ghost in a world that had already moved on to the news of a new queen rising from the Maryland woods. Kaelen led Sloane out of the bunker and back into the cool night air of the estate, where the gray wolves were waiting on the porch, their amber eyes soft with the recognition of their pack's survival. Fenris limped between them, his head held high and his tail wagging with a slow, rhythmic pride that told Sloane she was finally, truly home. They stood on the edge of the balcony, the Maryland skyline glittering in the distance like a field of fallen stars, and Kaelen pulled her close, his hand resting protectively over hers as the silver drive was finally deactivated, its work complete. Your father built this for you, Sloane, not so you could rule the shadows, but so the shadows could never touch you again, Kaelen said, his voice a low promise that carried on the pine-scented wind. The mystery of the Iron King was no longer a threat, but a sanctuary, and as Sloane looked at the man who had burned his own world to save hers, she knew that the girl she used to be was gone, replaced by a woman who knew the true weight of loyalty and the power of a pack. The final resolution was a masterpiece of emotional justice, a rags-to-riches story where the riches weren't just the millions in her father's recovered accounts, but the fierce, unyielding love of the man standing by her side and the dog who had bridged the gap between their souls. Silas was a footnote in a history book that was already being rewritten, a man whose name would be forgotten while Sloane's became a legend in the corridors of power and the hearts of the common people. The staircase of tension had finally reached the sky, and the view from the top was breathtaking, a world where the underestimated were the ones who truly held the leash. As the sun began to peek over the horizon, casting a golden light over the estate, Sloane realized that the kick at the mall hadn't been an ending, but a glorious, violent beginning. If you were moved by Sloane's journey from the marble floors of a mall to the throne of her own empire, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Melanin and the Mafia's pack for more stories of ultimate justice. Share this video with someone who needs to see that the underdog always wins when they have the right pack behind them, and comment below to let us know, what should Kaelen and Sloane's next move be? Should they take down a corrupt tech mogul or a traitor within the syndicate? Your support keeps the pack growing, and we can't wait to bring you the next chapter of this legacy. Thank you for watching, and remember, never touch the dog, or you might just lose your world. We'll see you in the next story.